I have to say, I think this is probably the event that I've done with the most people in here. We have 170 people here now, which is incredible. So if I can use the few minutes that I have as a rallying call to rational people, that now is a time when we have to look after our liberties and look after each other more than ever, because we're in a very, very dangerous place, and life has completely changed and values are changing beneath our feet and beyond recognition. Already in the past 6 months, as we all have endured, the nation was put under house arrest. Every single inch of everyday life has now been legislated, regulated, and for the most part, actually criminalized. There's no obvious public health benefit to a lot of this. Some of it is even counterproductive. Look at the curfew, for instance. There's no evidence base for much of it, and no evidence base has been provided, even when it's been legally required. And there's been no democratic process either. These rules, and now we have across all of the nations of the UK well in excess of 400 statutory instruments, which have by and large been brought into force by the pens of ministers rather than democratically elected MPs. And even ministers don't know what half of these laws are. In fact, even the Prime Minister doesn't, and ordinary people have absolutely no chance. And amidst all of this authoritarianism, there's no symmetry with provisions and things that would support public health. Instead, we have this very punitive system is being created around us that seems to trade on blame and criminalization and punishment. I don't know what happened to the field hospitals, but they never seem to be full and they never seem to be used. And in fact, people are now going undiagnosed, untreated for all sorts of things. There doesn't seem to be an awful lot of quarantine support. When people come back, even if they come back from countries that are on the quarantine list, they make their own way to a quarantine place on public transport. In fact, even some of our MPs have done that. So there's no real support for public health support. In fact, we don't even have a functioning test and trace system, as we've found out today. The people that we should be most worried about are the clinically vulnerable and also socially vulnerable. But one of the extraordinary things in the Coronavirus Act is that care requirements have been slashed, not increased. So the most vulnerable people in our communities are actually being left adrift by their local authorities because we have this fundamentalist coronavirus approach that puts this particular virus above all else, above everything else in society, and this is incredibly dangerous. An opportunity for course correction was missed. Was it last week, with the Coronavirus Act renewal vote. Unfortunately, in just 90 minutes, this act, which is of constitutional significance, that has unprecedented conferral of powers to ministers to ban protests, cancel elections, arbitrarily detain people, was renewed in 90 minutes with the opposition, with 6 honourable exceptions missing in action. Absolutely despicable. So now I think it's down to us. I think it's down to each and every one of us to take this incredible care about our liberties and about our loved ones. I saw 2 news stories today that really made me think about this, and you may have seen them too. One of them was a man racially abusing a 16-year-old girl and then eventually kicking her in the face for not wearing a mask on a bus. The other one was a family at a funeral in Milton Keynes who were sitting 2 meters apart from one another, and the mother sobbing at the funeral of her deceased husband was stopped from her son went to console her, and he was abruptly stopped and told to move apart. this is what worries me, actually, probably even more than these awful laws, is when this authoritarian drift starts to infect the public psyche and change the way that we behave and the way that we are to each other. That is something we have to be incredibly cautious of, because then really the game is lost. We cannot play this suspicion and blame game amongst each other. We need to have, I mean, I'm just drawing very quickly on what Patrick said about rights. Human rights are absolutely vitally important in our society. They're the anchor for modern society, and so it's the human rights frameworks that we have to look at now. But they don't operate by themselves. We have to have, you know, for example, a human rights experienced QC in the opposition who's willing to actually do something about some of this, who's very well versed in human rights. We should have learned from the post 9/11 years about how quickly we can drift and how quickly we can lose our frame of reference. And that's why one of the things we're doing at Big Brother Watch is producing monthly reports on emergency powers and civil liberties, so that we can look back and actually monitor that drift. And the reason that I decided to do that was because it was around the second week of March, I read a news article via a friend in Denmark, and Denmark introduced a law that closed borders, enforced lockdowns, and even introduces mandatory vaccines, even though there isn't yet a vaccine, in relation to coronavirus. I found it absolutely chilling that this could happen overnight, and I know that we are not that far away from a similar. In fact, I mean, we've almost already ticked all of those boxes. So we have to have an anchor, we have to have a frame of reference to draw us back to something that's recognizable to a free and liberal society. I want us to remember the first few weeks of this crisis, when community groups came together, we were doing food shopping for our elders, we were looking after each other, millions of people volunteered. It's that kind of voluntary action and community care that's important to get through this, not authoritarianism, not blame games, and not suspicion. And that's my message for today. One of the points that came up was the difference between the laws and regulations, and then there was something about human rights, I think, kind of being an assimilation between human rights and regulations. Human rights are, form part of the closest thing we have to constitutional law. They're completely fundamental to British life, and I like I said before, they don't work by themselves. I mean, they're an instrument to be used and to hold the government accountable with. And unfortunately, as I say, with honourable exceptions, the opposition has completely failed to do that and is sitting on the fence on lots of the big issues at the moment, whether it's torture or today state spies committing crimes under the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Bill. I mean, there's an awful lot that's being rammed through Parliament at the moment whilst no one's looking, that is incredibly dangerous and to British life itself and our values, which are entrenched in the Human Rights Act. I care much less about whether it's cock up or conspiracy. I think it's neither. I think it's an unhelpful dichotomy. I think it's probably a natural consequence of the set of circumstances and the kind of political structure that we have, which requires much more. It forces us to have much more introspection. But I think the fact that this is happening, I mean, has anyone thought about what this would have been like under a different type of government? I don't even want to go there right now. But the fact that this is happening under Boris Johnson, a self-proclaimed liberal, says so many things. It says something about the fundamental nature of the political structure we have and the kinds of forces that then has. As people have pointed out, it's the avoidance of liability, risk. In the early days, people were saying Boris the Butcher. That I think the government probably knew that they were going to be accused of having blood on their hands if they didn't take the most extreme, extraordinary measures. So there's this kind of natural force that evolves around the kind of political culture and political structure that we have. And I think it's also a reflection of how much we are so complacent. I use that word deliberately because, of course, Boris Johnson used it the other day in a completely inappropriate way. But how complacent we are about liberal values, that someone like Boris Johnson can, having put the country under house arrest without a democratic basis, refusing to provide evidence basis, refusing to have any debate, and trashing the institution of British parliamentary democracy, can stand in front of the nation and call himself a freedom-loving Tory. You know, liberalism is not just about words. It's not just, you know, feel-good rhetoric. It's actually practice and action. And we haven't seen liberal kind of values put into action under this government for some time. So that is why I think the most important thing, the thing I'm most interested to speak to people here about, is what are we going to do? How are we going to reclaim the values that are so important to us and that define us? Because we are at a very, very dangerous point in time now. I think we're almost beyond the point of return. I'm going to disagree with Luke. I think it's the definition of an authoritarian power grab, and you don't have to believe that it's a conspiracy in order to recognize that. I think the point that James made better than me is almost that this is a kind of function of the state, and it's the state's default way of dealing with things. A really good point was raised about how do we reassert liberal values. And I think we have to be ceaselessly rational, informed, and we have to be compassionate as well. And social solidarity is really, really important, especially now more than ever. And I think we also need to look to institutions in our country. I mean, I think some have been better than others, but to you know, always defend those values and do so with the institutional knowledge of how to do that. That's why I couldn't be prouder to be at Big Brother Watch right now. We're 10 years old. We've always stood up for these values, and now I think we're more important than ever. I just wanted to raise come back to one other point that was made about risk and death. One of the things that I think is quite that really took me aback about in the early days of the government's response to this is the way in which there was clearly immediately emerged this authoritarian dream of control. And in fact, they even put it into the, you know, tripartite mantra in the end, control the virus, which is a real fallacy. And also it relies on the idea that biological life is something distinct. This kind of fundamentalist policymaking relies on the fallacy that biological life is something distinct from social and economic decisions, which is a very, very strange thing. And it's even stranger that that could be sold to the left and the opposition in any way, because of course on the left you absolutely recognize that economic decisions are fundamental to the enjoyment and prosperity and longevity of biological life. So there's a kind of a philosophical thing to grapple with here, and it comes back, I think, to the basic function of the state. Of course they want to control something that's immediately quantifiable: cases, deaths, even though both of those are often contested statistics in terms of what they really mean and how we should interpret them, and all the other excess deaths have been largely ignored. I mean, there's a real imbalance there. So I hope that after this, if we're to come through this in any kind of sensible way, that we can have a deeper examination of the nature of statehood that we have, because I think after this and 9/11, you know, we are finding ourselves, as I said before, really beyond the point of return in terms of liberal values.